Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Hilaal TV. The special broadcast looks at the application brought by South Africa at the Hague International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of violating the Genocide Convention. This, of course, in the aftermath and ongoing onslaught against the people of Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, amounting to over 20,000 people who have been killed, thousands more injured, and thousands homeless, and many still buried under the rubble. To analyze the proceedings of the past 2 days, and also, and more importantly, looking at what lies ahead and what more can be done. We are joined by two guests, and I would like to introduce, first of all, former Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, who is also an ANC veteran. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And an executive member of the Palestine Solidarity Committee, Martin Jansen. Thank you for joining us and really, giving us your insights, sharing your insights on what has been two very momentous days, and I would say yesterday particularly was a momentous occasion. And if one followed social media, one looked at the various reactions, first of all from home, many people really feeling proud to be South Africans. We made our mark, and I think people really stood very proudly. And then internationally, the international reaction has been tremendous. Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, if I can first start with you, just in terms of the application, and we will not go into the legalese because much has been discussed about that aspect, but I think just from a point of view of what would you say, having been part of the governing structure in this country, what would have been the kind of discussion and the backroom sort of interaction to say, look, we are taking this matter to the International Court of Justice?
Well, thank you very much, Farid, for the question and for this program. I want to say that the backroom discussions would have been one of the most difficult discussions to be held by both the ANC and the Cabinet of South Africa. You must remember the backdrop to this isn't only the attempted genocide of the people of Gaza and the Palestinians. You must go back just a few months earlier when South Africa convened the BRICS summit in South Africa and was able to expand the BRICS summit to now have 40% of the world's people under one structure, more than 30%, a third of the global GDP under one structure, and really disrupting the unilateral system that obtained after 1989 and creating the possibility of a multilateral world. Now, America reacted with fierceness to that, accusing South Africa of aiding and abetting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That endangered, secondly, South Africa hosting in October the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act Summit, in which South Africa was actually threatened with being expelled from AGOA. Now that would cause enormous disruption to South Africa's exports, South Africa's trade with the USA and the West and so forth, and South Africa would have to weigh up whether all of this solidarity with Palestine was worth it. And therefore, to answer your question, if you look not only at the October genocide attempt, but you also look at the AGOA threats and you look at the standoff on BRICS, this was an enormously important decision, and the outcome of it to proceed with the application to the ICJ in The Hague, I think signals to me that maybe our country is capable of repairing, that our organizations like the ANC is beginning to identify again its moral clarity, and that we are willing to do the right thing again and to emerge from a decade of deprivation or depravity, if I can put it like that, and to really reassert our morality on the world stage. So it wasn't an easy decision, but I think it was brave, and it is rightly applauded by the freedom-loving people of the world.
Martin, just, from a solidarity point of view, and I think more so from the grassroots, where the Palestine Solidarity Committee and others who have stood, particularly over the past few months, but I think it goes back longer than that. Just in terms of what does it do to, the spirit of the people on the ground when you see this type of application, you see the kind of presentation, but just the decision to say, look, we are going to go and we're going to take Israel and really set out a really watertight case that they are violating the Genocide Convention, given what Ebrahim has just said about the kind of challenges that would obviously have faced the government.
Yeah, look, it's huge. What's happened, what South Africa has done is a game changer globally. I mean, for the specifics of Palestine and Israel, as we know, it's unprecedented. I mean, we've been campaigning, not only us as the PSC, but many others globally, have been campaigning for decades around this and for these kinds of measures. Because as you know, as people locally, let's say in South Africa, we don't have any real power to effect what's happening to the Palestinians. I mean, other than what the Israelis and the Zionists do themselves, they send their sons and daughters to go and fight in the Israeli occupation army. What can we do as solidarity activists? So much of our efforts have been directed towards government, because government's got the clout, it's got the power, it's got the influence globally, and of course utilizing the international law. And so for us, this is a huge, huge breakthrough, which has uplifted our spirits. I mean, after especially kind of depressive moments of 3 months of genocidal bombardment of the Palestinian people, this has certainly lifted the spirits, and you can see it on social media, and people are now more determined, more confident of doing much more than we've done before. So it's a real game changer, and some of the issues, I suppose the politics, we can get into more, but for us as a solidarity movement, this is a huge breakthrough, and will have ramifications for other areas of international law and in South Africa. For example, the fact that Zionists send their sons and daughters to operate in the Israeli army. It will set a kind of backdrop for legal challenges and strengthen what we've already done.
So, you mentioned the further action and the politics of it, and we will come to that. Ebrahim, just in terms of South Africa's presentation, and I think at the same time, just the Israeli presentation, which you may have caught some of it today. First of all, South Africa's presentation, everyone was elated. Your reaction to how we presented the case?
Look, I think we surprised Israel, particularly the United States and everyone else, because they expected a rah-rah solidarity presentation. What we came up was a legal presentation, a rational presentation, an evidence-based presentation. We didn't pick up an obscure Israeli saying death to the Palestinians. We picked up the Israeli president, the Israeli prime minister, the Israeli defense minister, the influential decision makers in Israel. We used their words to show intent for genocide, and we then matched those words with actions perpetrated by the Israeli Defense Force against the Palestinians. And so there was this very important web of connectivity between words, actions, intents, and historical mission to obliterate the Palestinian people and so forth. So I think the elation was at the brilliance and the excellence of the presentation, not the solidarity aspect of it. So that was the first thing. The second thing is those 83 or 84 pages would now constitute the legacy of a 75-year Nakba, catastrophe for the Palestinians, because for us, history did not start on the 8th, nor did it start on the 7th. It started in 1948. And that is the entirety of the history that is captured in that presentation. So, and if you look at the Israeli response today, it was not a response that could affect the merits. They tried to get other quotes in which Netanyahu may sound a bit more reasonable. They try to show that Israel is the Israeli Defense Force is an army of laws. They try to create the usual tropes that they come up with about human shields and all of those kind of things. But even their lawyers had to concede that they need to stand by the law. They need to. So the standard by which they were judged was already being raised. So to end, what I think South Africa was able to do was to persuade the reasonable middle ground of the global population why Israel has a case to answer for. And I am not surprised that the mainstream Western media, like CNN, did not lead at all with this, because they could not afford their middle ground to hear the case that South Africa was making.
Martin, Ebrahim mentioned, that South Africa had set the standard in terms of their presentation. The Israeli presentation, was it something that you expected, the kind of response?
Yes, definitely. If I were to just briefly analyze and summarize what they did, one was technicality, right? And the technicality surrounding communications between South Africa and Israel. And that they went into the dates of the communications, all of that. And then the question arises whether a dispute existed between South Africa and Israel. So that's the first question. So that's kind of a legal technicality. And then for the rest, which is the substantive aspect, so there's the procedural and then the substantive, was again the kind of Hasbara lies, which they just put in kind of sophisticated legal English terms, denial of these atrocities of the Israeli regime. The question of food, for example, they say no, they came up with all kinds of statistics about how much food and petroleum and all of these things that they supplied regularly, daily to Gaza, when as we know, they've been blocking, supplies from entering for months, and only allowing limited amounts to go in. So it's basically the lies of the Hasbara that they've repeated, and then a technicality to kind of undermine South Africa's case.
That brings us to the question, Martin, you raised the question of Hasbara. And so, I think one is, my view is that it's just going to intensify now after this. It's not as if the wind has been knocked out of their sails and said, look, we're going to throw in the towel. Look, we can't beat these guys with that sort of, it's just going to intensify, of course. And Ebrahim, you mentioned, the corporate media, they just ignored it or just put it as a second, third or fourth lead in the various bulletins. So Ebrahim, just looking at going forward, there have been victories, and sometimes we tend to become despondent and we say we're facing this onslaught. Let us look at just generally an overview of victories. Has the campaign over the past 3 months, apart from yesterday's very uplifting presentation, do you think these people have a sense of victory?
Look, a great victory would be if 8 of the 15 judges vote for South Africa's case and really get down in a year's time to pronouncing Israel as a genocidal power over the Palestinians. That would be a great victory. The immediate victory we want is the provisional order that stops Israel's atrocity, that prevents America and Europe from arming Israel, that opens up humanitarian corridors, that stops the depopulation of Gaza and moving people into refugee tent cities, etc., etc. I think that would be the most precious victory that we can have at this point.
But sorry to interrupt, but it's not necessarily, or Israel wouldn't necessarily abide by the ruling of the court. They're not bound by it.
No, and that's what impunity does. If you believe that you have enough behind you to do what you want to, then it's okay. And that will then bring us to the other victories. That if we have mobilized enough people to dispel the Hasbara, the lies, and to pierce it. And already you can see that Netanyahu has had to say, no, we don't intend to occupy Gaza. You've got to now say, no, we will halve our troops. That already begins to show that they are a power of impunity, but they do have their limits because they know that public opinion is shifting against them. The justifications for what they do and why they do it, it's going against them. And I'm not just speaking about the usual southeast corridors of the world. I'm speaking about the northwest corridors of the world where middle ground opinion is shifting against them. So that's a major victory, that solidarity becomes possible again. I think, for example, one of the things that they will not be able to easily regain is the fact that normalization, for the time being at least, hopefully permanently, is off the agenda. The neatly lined up dominoes of Saudi Arabia normalizing, UAE normalizing, Bahrain normalizing, Oman, and then moving on the pressure to every other Muslim state normalizing with Israel, that neat plan, which was about to be triggered, has been shot out of the water, at least for the time being. And that is a very important aspect of permission that is being withdrawn from both the US and from Israel. So I think this is a multifaceted game of chess, if I can put it like that, where we need to keep our eyes, and the kind of work that Palestinian Solidarity Committee and all solidarity groups, it may be that our work to win our gains only starts now, rather than to just put all our attention on the outcome of a court case.
So, Martin, that of course brings you into the picture, So we would say, in the court of public opinion, the victory is already there. But just picking up on what Ebrahim has said, actually, does this put more, I wouldn't want to say pressure on the various solidarity committees, PSC included, but expectations would probably be more accurate to say.
Not necessarily, but I fully agree with Ebrahim that this is a breakthrough. It's a kind of a win-win arrangement or situation. The first prize is, of course, kind of a restraining order on Israel to stop what it's doing, to stop the genocide, and provide relief to the Palestinians. But I think if you just look at it, what's happening now is unprecedented. Never before, as far as I'm aware, has the ICJ cases been live streamed, right? Yeah. And that was upon the request of South Africa, which is what we do regularly with important court cases. So what it means then is that literally the entire world has access to witnessing this process and listening to the information, the evidence, the legal arguments. That, for me, has got a huge impact globally. And what that means potentially, and even before the court case, we know that in most countries of the world, there's been a response, a mass response to Israel's atrocities and the US and the Western support for it, including in the US itself, where we know we have young Jewish people even now coming out and rebelling against the US government as well as what Israel is doing. So before this has already been happening, this has opened it up even more, greater exposure of the hypocrisy, the lies, the deceit, the bias of the West, and even the UN structures like the Security Council historically. So I think it will contribute to fueling more solidarity action and protest against those governments that are siding with Israel. And for us, that is a real big win as a solidarity movement.
I just want to stay with you, Martin, in terms of the solidarity movements and PSC particularly. You have put a lot of pressure on government. I mean, you've said, look, you should do this. And, you expressed earlier, great move by the government. What are your expectations of the government going forward?
Okay. As Ebrahim has highlighted, let's say the decision goes in favor of South Africa and against Israel. There's no kind of obligation on the part of Israel to adhere to the court's ruling, right? So what that would mean then is that what do we do? If the South African government made this application, what is the next step for them to enforce the ruling? And for us, the logical conclusion would be sanctions. Boycotts, divestment, sanctions, campaigning. South Africa would need to legislate BDS, those boycotts and sanctions against Israel, locally, nationally, campaign on the continent, and give the lead globally. And we are convinced that many other governments who support, especially those who supported South Africa's application, will do likewise. It's kind of similar to the anti-apartheid movement, especially in the mid to late 80s, where even the US adopted measures of sanctions against the apartheid regime. So for us, that would be the logical thing to follow. Because one of the big problems is that the court, the final court decision, where it arbitrates and says, yes, Israel has committed genocide or is continuing to commit genocide, will take years to conclude. And what happens in between? I mean, the other point I also wanted to raise, which relates to South Africa's case, the papers were very good in outlining the historical context and, as you know, what Ilan Papi referred to as incremental genocide. Right? So it's been very good in that. The presentations perhaps highlighted and understandably focused predominantly on Gaza. But as we know, for the past 3 months, especially in the West Bank, Israel has intensified its attacks on the Palestinian people in those areas. So the challenge for me in terms of the decision, and already the Israelis raised it in their arguments, I don't know if you heard the conclusion, about South Africa wanting to somehow smuggle in all the Palestinian areas into what essentially is a focus on Gaza, or ought to be a focus on Gaza. And that is concerning. But for me, the next step from South Africa must be boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. And as we know, that was very, very successful against the apartheid regime.
So Ebrahim, on that question, you know, I saw a tweet on X by the attorney Richard Spoor, for example, and very impressed with South Africa's presentation. But he then added, you know, does South Africa not consider, or did South Africa not consider the consequences of this action, particularly in terms of, as you mentioned earlier, AGOA and other trade links? How do you think that would be managed, and is that a concern?
Look, I spent a week in Washington in December, just as all of this was unfolding. And from previous contacts of mine through Washington, there are those pushing for what is called an interim review of South Africa's participation in AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, meaning that there is going to be a review that could look at whether South Africa should continue. Should it continue until the end of this term or be ended before this term? And if they extend it for the rest of Africa, can South Africa be excluded from it? That has enormous implications because there are 600 US companies in South Africa employing about 200,000 workers at very important like motor car companies, the exports like oranges from the Western Cape, etc. So those are all, and that's what makes South Africa's decision so brave to continue with the case. And therefore, I think part of it, the global solidarity has to be to protect South Africa from those kind of consequences and to find ways in which we compensate for whatever South Africa may be forced to give up. The second thing out of that is that I think that with the facts being more available, as Martin explains, it's that we've got to take the solidarity from the usual suspects like South Africa into the unusual suspects. We've got to be able to go to these former Occupy movements, the kind of Seattle activists, etc., and inspire them that this is, that before there was the Vietnam solidarity, then there was the anti-apartheid solidarity, and so forth. This is the wave. The Occupy ones in the global economic meltdown, and now this is the wave that we've got to all get in if we are going to really mobilize ordinary citizens, both in the Western capitals as well as in the Arab streets behind this, so that the Arab streets never allow their governments to return to normalization, and it becomes harder. And so, for example, one of the questions I had to answer in the US, who should they vote for? I said in South Africa, there are other options that we exercised under apartheid. An articulated don't vote is as powerful as a vote. And an articulated vote for a protest candidate is as powerful as any other vote. And so what does the last part mean? The first part is don't vote, but you must articulate it. You must say why. The second one is, why would we not be able, for example, to get all right-minded people, particularly a core Muslim constituency, to vote for a Cornel West, but articulate it that this is our protest against US foreign policy. This is our protest against the blank check to Israel. This is our protest for you vetoing ceasefires and this thing. This is our protest for you voting against South Africa's application. So I think we've got to now become very creative with how we mobilize the streets in the West and in the East, the North and the South around it. So I think it's going to test our creative ground. We've got to coordinate, and that together with the elements that Martin is speaking about BDS, I think those are the armory that we've got to prepare now already for the outcomes.
So on that score, and interesting you mentioned Seattle, because one of the people who really, the activist and the revolutionary, I would say, was our own Dr. Dennis Brutus. He was very much part of the old Seattle movement. I mean, one of the most successful shutdowns of a city. That brings us to the global kind of action and solidarity, Martin. And you mentioned BDS, and there are people, I mean, sometimes people don't express it, but they say, what about the jobs? We have huge unemployment in this country. And what if we are punished in that way? How would, first of all, the solidarity movements counteract that? And then just taking a step further, building global solidarity so that what Ebrahim is talking about, there's a kind of a protection for what South Africa or the government would be doing, and the government would feel bold in saying, look, we've got this international protection, if I'm articulating that correctly. Martin?
Yeah, look, on the first one, the concern about jobs, which is obviously a very valid concern, more so in South Africa with high unemployment. From my direct experience, particularly of the 80s, when I worked for the chemical union, that was the same concern we had. Because in the chemical industry, these are predominantly multinationals, pharmaceuticals and petroleum. So we embarked on a particular process. The first thing is to get our members informed and educated about the issues so that they support the demands, right? The second thing was that we then directly pressurized the companies that they must oppose their governments and what their governments are doing, and had to prove that. So, for example, Mobil had to indicate that they were against South Africa's apartheid practices and in some ways supported sanctions as well. So we put those demands and the workers supported that. And as you know, in the case of Mobil, there was a transition where it was bought over by Engine. So that's what we think should happen in cases where jobs might be impacted upon. The same, for example, locally with Cape Union Mart. As you know, we're campaigning for a boycott of Cape Union Mart because its owner, Philip Kravitz, has been a direct supporter, material supporter of the Israeli regime and consequently oppression of the Palestinians and consequently genocide. We were approached by the union, raising concerns about job losses and so on. And in fact, we had a meeting. Our main issue, I suppose, with the union is that have they discussed the issues with the members of Cape Union Mart, and in fact all their members, so there wouldn't necessarily be this concern. And in fact, it should be the members who are putting pressure on Philip Kravitz to stop his support of Israel. So for us, it's really about process and tactics as to how we do this. And of course, we cannot be impatient, but we need to do it. Just to comment also on Ebrahim's point about the traditional US bullying and the concerns and anxiety that the African government might have had of consequences from the US and other partners like Britain, and so on. I think it works both ways. South Africa is very strategic for the US, Britain, etc., not only politically but also economically. It's kind of the route to the market in Africa. And politically, of course, it's strategic. So they wouldn't want to risk losing South Africa, not necessarily as an ally, but a partner in the region, right? And there's contestation. So it's not simply that South Africa is a potential victim, but South Africa has got status and standing and power itself. So these things are negotiated. It's not entirely a one-sided thing where the bully, the power of the US, can just dictate what needs to be done, and therefore South Africa and others should cower under that. And I think they also weighing that up. Britain, the US is weighing that up as well. And I think up to now, South Africa has taken independent positions, like, for example, BRICS, the formation of BRICS and so on. And there haven't been serious consequences. There are no sanctions against South Africa. And for me, it's obvious why.
Ebrahim, just on that, and I want to come back to the question of global solidarity with grassroots movements. But Ebrahim, just on the question of BRICS, for example, do you see BRICS being the kind of not necessarily a buffer, but something that could counter whatever actions may be threatened? And as Martin has pointed out, we don't have that. We don't plead victimhood, but we say, look, we have something to where we can stand on our own.
So BRICS is essentially an amalgamation of emerging, developing markets rather than a coherent political formation. So that's the first thing we must see, because we've got all kinds of politics in BRICS, but the one thing that holds us together is that we are emerging markets. So that's the first thing. So for example, one could be thinking South Africa hosted BRICS, but we have a Russian judge, we have a Chinese judge, we have an Indian judge, we have a Brazilian judge. They'll all vote for us. That's not true. Because, for example, the Chinese judge may say, well, if we open up this Pandora's box, we could be next facing charges about the killing of Uyghurs in there. India could be very worried about their treatment of Muslims and not open up that door. And so I can go on to show that these votes are not easily counted. So BRICS is not a coherent political formation, although it is an imposing economic formation, and its politics must grow as we go. And so that's why we're not saying that the world is becoming bilateral. I think the world could becoming multilateral. And that's very important because it subtracts from the power of the northwest corridor of the world. So that's the first thing that I think we need to be having. The other thing is that a lot of emerging markets have their own priorities. They are facing massive poverty at home and therefore don't have the kind of largesse to just do investments all over the show and fill a gap left by your kind of northwest corridors. So South Africa, to protect itself in the way that Martin suggests, would have to make sure in the short term we tighten the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. No one must find a gap between African countries, and therefore if you want to expel South Africa, you can pick up Kenya. We've got to make sure that those kind of things, those kind of gaps don't open up. The second thing is the same thing with regard to BRICS. The quality of exports may differ because 70% of what we export to the US is manufactured, and that has a lot of jobs, whereas 80% of what we export to China are raw. So there are qualitative differences, but we've got to make sure that we can economically pick up those kind of slack. But I'm not pessimistic. I think we are playing high-level chess with the US. I think it's about who's blinking. South Africa didn't blink with BRICS. It didn't blink with AGOA. It didn't blink on Gaza or Palestine. And hopefully it will not blink as the pressure mounts on us. But I think we're going to need to really build up our global coalitions, economic and political, in order to manage the turbulence that I think is coming up.
So talking of coalitions, Martin, the earlier questioner asked you about global solidarity. And here we're looking at, Ebrahim mentioned Vietnam, Seattle movement, and, various international movements. And there was this kind of, excuse me, we may not have been actively involved, but our movements, our organizations were fully aware of those struggles, international struggles. But as far as Palestine is concerned and the solidarity movement, is there really a global kind of solidarity movement? We see actions all over, but is there something that's coordinated where there's an exchange of tactics and strategies?
There is and there isn't, right? On the one hand, we've got the Boycott National Committee, or BDS National Committee, BNC, which is based in Ramallah and Palestine, and they've played a coordinating role for the BDS movement globally. And you could say that they affiliated and member organizations on different continents, including in South Africa is the South African BDS Coalition, of which we are a member along with 8 or 9 other solidarity organizations. But my view is that there hasn't been sufficient coordination, right, at 2 levels. One, specifically by the BNC in terms of the BDS campaign globally, but the other thing that's missing, right, unlike, and I'm not sure about Vietnam, but if you take the anti-apartheid movement, the political organizations, especially the ANC, to a lesser extent the PAC, played a role in giving some direction and influencing the anti-apartheid movement. So there was collaboration. Independence on the one hand by the anti-apartheid groups, but they did collaborate with the liberation movement organizations. Now, we don't have that in the case of Palestine, which is unfortunate. So often we kind of ask ourselves, now, what are the Palestinians saying about this or that? And we don't have direction. And as we know, the political leadership in many ways is problematic, right? The PA and some of its atrocities that it's committed, it's kind of what we would call sellout positions, etc., etc. So who do we turn to work with in terms of providing solidarity? And that's a big problem for us. But the BNC does exist, but I just feel they're not playing enough of a coordinating role. However, the good news is, and interestingly, it's predominantly a South African initiative led by the likes of Reverend Frank Chikane. There is going to be a big anti-apartheid conference, global, scheduled for May this year, right? And the main item on the agenda, of course, is Palestine and solidarity. So that is happening, and hopefully out of that, something bigger, more solid organizationally will emerge.
Sorry, Ebrahim. Yeah, yes.
In my meeting with some of the Palestinian activist leadership, that I, for example, insist as South Africa, because of this potential incoherence that I think Martin is alluding to, I insist that the slogan, Biruch Bidam Nabdika Ya Aqsa, must be amended, particularly for South Africans. Of course, Biruch with our soul. Bidam, Palestinians have enough brave warriors to give their blood. Nabdika Ya Aqsa, Aqsa as a symbol, but not of a mosque, not of a religious entity, but of a people and the symbol of a nation. I would amend it by saying, Bi'aql, with our intellect, with our strategic wisdom. That's what I think we also need to bring into it. Because we can't be loyal solidarity activists without giving the most important resource that we can give as South Africans, and that's strategic advice. South Africa, for example, did not recruit globally into factions, but into a solidarity movement. It didn't confuse the world with the intricacies of our visions. It spoke about a united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic and free South Africa, and that's mother's milk and apple pie to the whole world. Everyone could see the morality in that. Everyone could see the mobilizing power, because those are not disputable values. We're not debating at this point, the end game and all of those kind of things in Palestine. I think the opportunity is there to revision Palestinian solidarity around a set of coordinates. Israel has murdered the two-state solution. What is its replacement? And by and large, I'm more of the view, having historically been a two-state person out of pragmatism, I think the murder of the two-state solution with the occupation of Gaza, the settlements in the West Bank, the effective securitization of the West Bank, the dismemberment of the PA, etc., all of that means that what is on the table could be a united, non-racial, non-religious, secular, democratic, free, one person, one vote state from the river to the sea. And that is what I think Israel fears the most. It has created it, but it fears it the most. And maybe we should unite even as a strategic interlude that could lead to a two-state solution with some integrity. But I do believe the interlude of a single undivided state is the thing that Israel would fear and the West would fear the most, so suddenly Blinken is all over saying, no, we need to give the Palestinians a state.
Exactly.
Was never interested in it. Suddenly out of this, he's now saying, what state can we give them? So I'm saying that there is a moment for a strategic reset, and the solidarity, which historically is supportive, I think has to become a little bit more assertive, because otherwise we will sit with the incoherence that comes out of Palestine and impose it on it, and that is why we're not getting the kind of traction, because people don't always know what end game are they supporting.
So just to, maybe put you on the spot here, Ebrahim, do you think the South African government may see this as an opportunity now and a moment to say, look, let's reconsider our call for a two-state solution and maybe argue the way you have actually argued?
I'd like to persuade the ANC that this is the only way forward, holding on to the old idea of a two-state solution when the facts on the ground, and I'm using facts on the ground as Israelis speak, not our analysis. I think South Africa must go one step further and say, we have lost faith. Maybe it can't say it as I'm saying it, but it has to proclaim that Israel's activities, facts on the ground, have made the two-state solution impossible, and therefore we must go back to the drawing board and maybe bring the South African solution to Israel and gain traction for that in the non-aligned world, in the BRICS world, etc., as the biggest push against Israel, because Israel gets away with impunity because it thinks that it doesn't have to give a state, when it has to give up its own state in values that they can't argue with: non-racialism, democracy, secular, etc. I think that may change the calculus a little bit. I'm not confident about it, but I'm positing it.
The challenge at the moment, I fully agree, and from the PSC, we do support the idea of a one-state, democratic state for all, the right of return of refugees, etc. The weakness, though, and it's an understandable weakness, is that the main parties of the liberation movement of Palestine, I saw a summary of their resolution. They met, I think, in December, right, in Lebanon. Yes. There's no mention of an end game. And their main concern, which is understandable, is the immediate defense of the people against Israel's attacks and atrocities. But that is a political weakness. And I think perhaps from our side as a solidarity movement, if we can, is to influence them that they need to look beyond and the so-called end game, and also look at kind of reviving the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a kind of a united front of all the resistance movements and political parties and so on. So I think for me that's the biggest strategic task at the moment, so that call hopefully for one state, comes from them and directs us in terms of our solidarity work as well.
Yeah.
Just maybe a comment, and maybe you can comment on my comment, is that it was interesting to see, although South Africa did not officially host Hamas, Hamas, in the past there was a kind of a distance between the South African government and Hamas, or Hamas wasn't kind of recognized as such, maybe unofficially, yes. But there was this, in fact, there were certain ANC members who actually met with Hamas, Does that indicate kind of and this is my comment is that, that's an interesting development. But just, both Ebrahim and Martin, I would just like to say, is that an opportunity to perhaps say, look, let's revive the PLO and Hamas and other groupings become part of it? Do you think this is an opportunity given Hamas's recent kind of visits here and interactions?
Just before Martin comes in.
Okay, maybe, Ebrahim,
because
yes?
I have a very distinct memory of January 2006. This was the election in Palestine. We sat in a cabinet Lekhotla, under the chairpersonship of Thabo Mbeki. One day of that meeting, after tea time, Thabo Mbeki comes in and says, "We have just received the news. Hamas has won the election. What do we do?"
Okay.
We spent the next few minutes. It didn't take long. The consensus was, if they won the election, it was free and fair, we've got to recognize them.
Okay.
So the thing with Hamas is not a love affair. Let me just put that to you, because that's why our legal team had to work from a basis of even being critical of Hamas yesterday in order to move forward and being critical of Israel. But it's not a love affair, because our historical relationship was with Fatah. That is the access. And even yesterday, South Africa legal team was complemented by representatives of that kind of Fatah PA move. But because of our historical recognition of the election victory by Hamas, we have had to do the logical thing, and that is to treat them as if they are the de facto government. In addition to our compromise on maintaining ties with Mahmoud Abbas and the PA. And so that, I think, is a very important thing, because Israel was alleging today that we were the legal representatives of Hamas. They're trying to obscure this thing, and had they not occupied Gaza after Hamas's victory, they denied the will of the electoral will of the Gazans to be governed by Hamas, and made governance impossible, and made what should have been a de facto government, turned them into a guerrilla army. Now they are crying crocodile tears because of what they had reduced Hamas to. And South Africa keeps that door open so that our bi'aql, our intellect, our strategic wisdom could continue to be transmitted. So I just wanted to give that little gap.
No, absolutely. So, Martin, kind of South Africa playing a pivotal role in kind of getting a PLO which is widely representative?
I think the prospects for that happening now is really great. Partly also because of the referral by South Africa to the ICJ. So it's kind of got more clout and influence amongst not only Fatah and Hamas, but probably the entire liberation movement. The other parties as well, as you know. So I do think that they do have, but also I think we as ordinary people of South Africa, especially through the Solidarity movement, must also play a role in influencing that. And unfortunately, as I said earlier, for too long there's been the separation between the political side of things, the political movement and leadership, and the Solidarity movement in the form of BDS, right? And I think there needs to be some convergence between those so that we can influence it in a democratic manner, and also draw the links between our civil society and the Palestinians themselves. And I'm hopeful, and I don't know at this stage, but that anti-apartheid conference will include the political leadership of the movement in Palestine, all the political groups and organizations.
So that would be an opportunity,
That
really.
would, and we can then develop a common strategy and the so-called end game as well.
Yeah. Just to kind of, summarize our discussions, so, an interesting point that you mentioned was about the political movements. Okay. Elections are coming up, and we've seen the various positions, various political parties have taken as far as this is concerned. In fact, on the eve of the application, headline news on our news bulletins was that the Democratic Alliance, the DA, and the ACDP clearly, said, we don't support South Africa's application. Okay, so they've kind of chosen this side, and we see other issues as well, playing out. Just in terms of the rest of the political parties and those who have expressed clearly, on which side they stand, do you think social, and I'm first going to ask you, Martin, to address this, and you mentioned earlier trade unions, and many people feel, unfortunately, our trade union movement is not as vibrant as it was and as it should be. Is this an opportunity to say, look, the political organizations, look, when it comes to elections, you've got your issues and really critical issues, but when it comes to solidarity with the struggle in Palestine, do you think the people's movements would be working together much more closely with the political parties? I wouldn't say political movements, but I'm talking specifically political parties.
Yeah, look, it depends on the positions that those political parties obviously have and will be taking in the future. And that's already happening. In fact, we are part of a group called on WhatsApp, Voice for Palestine, and it includes a few political parties already, including the ANC, EFF, Al-Jamaa, I think, as well. So there is that coming together. But of course, we're wary of the political parties as well, because we fear that, the solidarity work, especially now, can be abused for electioneering. So there's that tension as well. But just taking a step back on South Africa's political parties, and what I find remarkable, which perhaps doesn't answer your question directly, but what's always astounded me for a very long time is the extent to which those who support Zionism in South Africa, whether as individuals or as parties, are still given the kind of credibility and respect and political and social acceptance which we would never have given if they were openly declaring their support for the AWB or for the Nazis. And yet what Israel is, right? So for example, I read a paper recently, 94% of Israelis, the population, supports what's happening in Gaza. In other words, supports genocide. It's kind of akin to Germany in the late 30s. So I'm kind of baffled as to why you have these academics, or Milton Shane, the Jewish Board of Deputies, the South African Zionist Federation, the DA, the ACDP. They just accept it as normal. They're not ostracized. And of course the mainstream media plays a role in that whatever they have to say is kind of respectable. But my own view is that this is totally unacceptable. What they are supporting goes completely against the grain of the South African Constitution, particularly the Bill of Rights. How can this be tolerated? And for me, there needs to be some form of punitive measures taken against such people, such individuals, and parties. And we know already we have legislation for that. Hate speech, for example. People are put on trial, etc. They're punished. Why is it that just because it's an international activity, that there are no punitive measures against these people?
So Ebrahim, just on that, picking up from what Martin has said, do you think there should be this kind of clear line between, those who are supporting, as Martin rightly pointed out, openly supporting the Zionist project, in all its manifestations, and then you have, what sort of what can be invoked really in terms of our constitution to say, look, you're on the wrong side of morality?
I think we've reached a watershed moment. Yesterday's presentation by South Africa to the International Court of Justice was the throwing down of the gauntlet, was the flexing of South Africa's constitutional muscle based on a Bill of Rights. And South Africa has gone down a path from which they cannot find a reverse gear. So I think that that's the one thing. The second thing, Martin is right. How does that apply locally? What do we now do? Because we do have provisions against mercenaries. We do have provisions against selling arms.
But they've not been invoked.
No, but what I'm saying is we're now down that creek. And we have chosen a particular path, and so we can only, like a snowball, accumulate what needs to be done now, because there's no way we are going to be loved again by a Zionist world. They've proven how fickle they are in terms of investments and all of those kind of things, but I do think that we are down that particular path. So those are things that are on the cards. The third thing is that parties, at the very moment that the ANC regains its moral authority, and we must make sure in any agreements with the ANC about whether they deserve the votes of the freedom-loving people of South Africa, but amongst them the Muslim community, whether this morality translates into governance morality. Are we going to be as strong on corruption? Is that in our rear view mirror increasingly? Are we going to be strong on good governance? Are we going to get right the infrastructure, the institutions of the country again? Are we going to be strong on crime? We can be strong on global crime. Can we be strong on local crime? Do we have the will? And I think that that is a negotiating position that comes out of this very tenuous coalescing of forces around the suffering of the Palestinians. And therefore the unions, rather than being the voting fodder, can be a more directive voice in such discussions. What is the Charter of Agreements, globally and nationally? And I would say, don't give anyone a blank check, negotiate a particular coalition. In much the same way, the DA literally is painting itself into a corner by painting over Palestinian flags, invoking municipal laws that we never knew about, tolerating gangster hate speech, and criminal directions on flags. But the moment a few colors come on in the Palestinian flag, they're there with their brigade, etc. I mean, so for example, my sermon that I just did today, I said to Muslims, you are at the crossroads in your decision making. Do you want to vote as citizens? If you vote as citizens, you can be angry about load shedding, but what is that in comparison with people whose houses have been flattened by Israeli bombs? You can be angry about, for example, potholes, but in Palestine, you're navigating craters in the road where bombs landed. So do you choose as a citizen, or do you choose as part of a global community which has identified South Africa as a beacon of strength and morality in a world where even the countries of the OIC and the Arab League and so forth have not had the guts to confront Israel? And maybe if we agree on that, we should also say we want to support you as an ANC, but these are the conditions of our support.
Martin, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to give you the last word, and particularly just rounding up what Ebrahim has said.
Look, as I said, overall, South Africa's referral to the ICJ is a global game changer, politically and otherwise, for the solidarity movement, and also exposing the Western governments. And in fact, I think it will pressurize Western governments to shift the position, including the USA eventually. And I think this is a big breakthrough that the government has initiated and can only improve the situation for the Palestinians, and in the long run, the final liberation of Palestine, hopefully in the form of a so-called one state, a democratic state, for Palestinians and all those living in historical Palestine, Israelis and so on. And of course with the right of return, or the returning Palestinians, those living in exile, those refugees back to Palestine, and to create a better future for all living there into in perpetuity.
Thank you very much, Martin Jansen, who is the executive member of the Palestine Solidarity Committee. Thank you for joining us. Former Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, ANC activist, veteran, I should say. Thank you as well for your input. And I think, something that has come out of this discussion really is the convergence, I think, between views across various political spheres, I would say. And really, I think as we move forward, there are strong political and social groupings, civic movements, and I think the conference that's coming up, the anti-apartheid conference, will perhaps see, South Africa again playing that kind of vital role and making a big difference to the lives of ordinary Palestinians. Because while we are talking, bombs are falling on the Palestinians. There are thousands who are still in the rubble. So we can have our discussions, which are very important, but always with that in mind, that we are talking about real lives, we are talking about real people. From the panel here, and as your host, Farid Sayed, I thank you for joining us this evening, and to Hilaal TV, again bringing you an important discussion, a discussion which I think we can take further. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.